and thank you for joining us for the Spring 2013 Alan T. and Linda M. Beinfort Lecture. My name is Carl Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of Chesterton House, the sponsor of the Beinfort Lecture. Chesterton House is a Center for Christian Studies at Cornell and an affiliate member of Cornell United Religious Work. The Beinfort Lecture is made possible by a gift of Carl and Elaine Noyce. Thank you, Carl, in honor of their friends, the late Al Beinfort and his wife Linda. We are very grateful to the Noyces and the Beinforts for their generous support, and also today to the Cornell Catholic community for co-sponsoring the lecture. The Beinfort Lectureship is designed to address questions related to faith and public life, big questions about nature, knowledge, meaning, purpose, and value. Today's lecture is entitled C.S. Lewis on Reason and Imagination in Science and Religion. Lewis was, of course, a brilliant and prolific Oxford Don, known both for his scholarly literary criticism as well as for the Chronicles of Narnia. Speaking of Narnia, we are privileged to have with us today the man who claims in his dissertation to have discovered the secret interpretive key to the Chronicles of Narnia, namely the 7 planets of the medieval cosmos, which, as we all know, is utterly preposterous. As one reviewer of Planet Narnia put it, if the Chronicles of Narnia have had 100 million readers, what are the odds on the 100 million and first suddenly stumbling on the truth? Well, claims that at first appear preposterous apparently sometimes surprise. My castle of skepticism regarding this thesis, writes Lewis scholar Alan Jacobs, was gradually but utterly demolished as I read this thoughtful, scholarly, and vividly written book. New York Times bestselling author Eric Metaxas has called Planet Narnia mind-blowing and one of the most spectacular literary discoveries of our time. And C.S. Lewis's former secretary, Walter Hooper, says, "I cannot contain my admiration. No other book on Lewis has ever shown such comprehensive knowledge of his works and such depth of insight." Even David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, in the midst of the 2008 presidential campaign, paused to spend one of his columns treating the thesis of Planet Narnia. Why? We tend to see economics and politics as the source of human motives, Brooks wrote, and then explain spirituality as their byproduct. But to be reminded of the different mentality of the Middle Ages, he said, is like a refreshing dip in a cool and cleansing pool. Michael Ward holds degrees from Oxford, Cambridge, and St. Andrews. In addition to his position as Senior Research Fellow at Oxford's Blackfriars Hall, he's also a trustee of the Chesterton Library in Oxford. I first heard Michael speak at the American Chesterton Society conference in Seattle a few years ago, and despite not being a Chesterton scholar per se, he gave what was probably the finest paper I have ever heard on Chesterton. And if that were not enough to establish his credibility, his final claim to fame is that he appeared in the 1999 James Bond film, The World Is Not Enough. For all of these reasons, it's our great privilege to have him here today. Please join me in extending him a warm welcome.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, everybody, for forsaking this brilliant sunshiny afternoon and coming indoors. I'm very grateful to see you all, and I ought also to welcome the 50 or 60 people who are watching this online. So let me begin. And I'm here to speak about C.S. Lewis on reason and imagination in science and religion. And before I begin my remarks, I really owe you both an explanation and an apology. What requires explanation, perhaps, is why we're addressing this topic at all, given that Lewis wasn't a scientist. we know Lewis principally as the writer of certain famous works like the Narnia Chronicles, the Screwtape Letters. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine shortly after publishing the Screwtape Letters. That's why he's got the devil and the angel either side of his head. And if we don't know him for his fiction, then we probably know him for his Christian apologetics, works like Mere Christianity, The Problem of Pain, and so forth. Neither of those departments of his output was actually his professional undertaking. He was professionally a literary critic and literary historian, and not a scientist. So why are we talking about his views on science? Well, I suppose the main reason is because Carl Johnson invited me to do so. But the reason I accepted was because, although Lewis wasn't a scientist, he was nonetheless a vastly well-read literary and intellectual historian, and his reflections from that perspective upon the nature of scientific language, and in particular the implications of the Copernican revolution in astronomy, they are both very thought-provoking and valuable, I think. Well worth spending an hour of your life thinking about. Although it's right to acknowledge at the outset that Lewis wasn't a scientist, we ought not to overstate the poverty of his scientific education, for as well as having that philological and historical perspective, which will be the main subject of my remarks, Lewis was fairly well acquainted, actually, with some areas of modern science, chiefly physics and cosmology. For example, he was reasonably au fait with the works of figures such as Sir James Jeans and Sir Arthur Eddington. He makes occasional references to figures like Sir Fred Hoyle, indicating that he did keep a watching brief from an admittedly amateur point of view on developments in astronomy. He also, of course, had scientists among his colleagues, both at Oxford and Cambridge, and evidently picked up a certain amount piecemeal from them. Erwin Schrödinger, for instance, was his colleague for 5 years at Magdalen College, Oxford, during the 1930s, and Schrödinger even makes a brief appearance in Lewis's first science fiction novel, Out of the Silent Planet. So that's the explanation, such as it is, why we're looking at this subject at all. And the apology? Well, I ought really to apologize for the title of my talk, because it runs the risk of misrepresenting, possibly, Lewis's thought on the matter. By putting science and religion alongside each other in this way, we might suppose that they are, in his thinking, two utterly distinct and maybe discontinuous disciplines. But as far as Lewis was concerned, that would be a mistake. He once said in his book on prayer, and if you have the handout in front of you, this is the first quotation on your sheet, he once said that there is danger in the very concept of religion. It carries the suggestion that this is one more department of life, an extra department added to the economic, the social, the intellectual, the recreational, and all the rest. But that whose claims are infinite can have no standing as a department. Either it's an illusion, or else our whole life falls under it. We have no non-religious activities, only religious and irreligious. In other words, for Lewis, religion, religion, which means the effort to find the unity of all things, to tie every single thing back into a oneness, to religament, to religature. Religion, in this sense, is the total set of all our knowledge and indeed all our life. If we're thinking in terms of Venn diagrams, religion is the set and science is a subset. It would therefore be fair to speak about C.S. Lewis on religion and irreligion, but not in this sense about religion and science, unless you equate science with irreligion, which Lewis certainly did not. He sometimes attacks what he calls scientism, by which he means a certain outlook on the world which is casually connected with the popularization of the sciences, though it is much less common among real scientists than among their readers. Scientism, Lewis defines as the belief that the supreme moral end of humankind is the perpetuation of our own species, and that this is to be pursued even if, in the process of being fitted for survival, our species has to be stripped of all those things for which we value it, of pity, of happiness, and freedom. But scientism isn't science. Science, in Lewis's lexicon, is a noble pursuit, very honourable undertaking, and indeed part of the religious life properly understood. If religion, and specifically in Lewis's case, the Christian religion, if religion is true, then he says it must be cosmic, encompassing everything, including science, and science therefore can't be non-religious, though it might become irreligious, either through degenerating into scientism or through other possible corruptions, one of which we'll have cause to look at in a few moments. So if that science-religion dichotomy is a false one, or at any rate a potentially unhelpful one, so is another dichotomy which has an important bearing on our topic, the dichotomy between reason and imagination. Often you'll find people talking about reason and imagination as if they are opposed, facing each other across a divide, eyeing one another, respectfully if warily, with the one never transgressing into the other's territory. According to this way of thinking, science proceeds by means of the exercise of reason, while non-scientific disciplines are less fully rational, and therefore less trustworthy. This opposition of reason and imagination is so firmly entrenched in our language, and so firmly embedded in our ways of thinking, that it's quite difficult actually to escape, and I often find it quite a job to drill into my students' minds the idea that in Lewis's view, reason and imagination are not only not opposed, but they are very intimately, albeit asymmetrically, related to each other. For in Lewis's view, reason could only operate if it was first supplied with materials to reason about, and it's imagination's task to supply those materials. Therefore, science is necessarily and foundationally imaginative. Now, in order to provide an easy and, I hope, maybe even amusing introduction to Lewis's thinking on this subject, let me relate the following untrue story. One day I took my car into the garage to have its annual overhaul, and at the end of the repair job I collected the car and I was driving out of the garage forecourt when I realised I'd forgotten to check on something. So I wound down the window, called over my shoulder to the car mechanic and said to him, "Are my rear indicator lights working?" And the car mechanic replied, "Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes." Now, that little exchange neatly encapsulates Lewis's definition of imagination. Imagination is a notoriously slippery term, and different thinkers and writers define it in very different ways, and I'm not going to get into all the other possible ways of defining it, but according to Lewis, imagination is simply the organ of meaning. Imagination is, for Lewis, the organ of meaning. And my car mechanic, let's call him Billy, his organ of meaning was sadly deficient. A flashing phenomenon, as far as he was concerned, could only have one possible meaning: electrical failure. So he's able to see the raw data, the light on, the light off, the light on, but he's unable to discover the correct meaning of these brute facts. He has sight, but he has no insight. He focuses on the externals and fails to perceive their inner significance. Not that Billy was entirely without the capacity to perceive meaning. He knew the basic meaning of an electrical circuit. He knew that when a light shines, a connection has been made, and when a light goes off, the connection must somehow have been broken. But he's unable to find a meaning in the relationship between the light shining and the light going off. He's unable to perceive that, in this case, an intermittent light means indicator, not insecure connection. Lewis's definition of imagination as the organ of meaning appears in a very important but much overlooked essay called Blustels and Flallen Spheres, a Semantic Nightmare. And I think one of the reasons it's been overlooked is because it has that terrible title. It was first published in 1939, and it's mainly concerned with how metaphors are created and used, but the essay also has some larger scale epistemological observations. As well as defining imagination as the organ of meaning, Lewis defines the opposite of meaning as, well, he asks the question, what is the opposite of meaning? Is it error? No, it's nonsense. It's a bit of a trick question, really. The opposite of meaning is obviously meaninglessness. Nonsense. Things must rise up out of the swamp of nonsense into the realm of meaning if the imagination is to get any handle on them. Only once we've established that the thing has meaning can we begin to judge whether its meaning is true or false. Before something can be either true or false, it must mean. Even a lie means something, and a lie understood as a lie can be very instructive. Why is this person lying to me? Only nonsensical things mean nothing. Back to Billy and the car. Not every flashing light on a car is meaningful. Sometimes there really are loose connections, whose occasional bursts of luminosity, flickering on and off in no particular rhythm, we should indeed best describe as nonsensical. The connections are arbitrary. They're random. They're meaningless. But if the connections are regular or patterned, we would be inclined to conclude that they were significant, they were meaningful. But what kind of meaning would they have? A true meaning, showing that the driver is about to make a right-hand turn, or a false meaning, showing that the driver had forgotten to cancel the lever? It's human reason, in Lewis's view, that judges between possible meanings, helping us to differentiate those meanings which are true and illuminating from those which are false and deceptive. So to summarize his definitions, reason is the natural organ of truth. Imagination is the organ of meaning, and meaning itself is the antecedent condition of both truth and falsehood. Imagination, for Lewis, therefore, is the prius of truth. Before something can be either true or false, it must mean. So we shouldn't think of reason and imagination as facing each other like this, staring at each other across the gulf. We should think of them rather as related like this, with reason resting upon imagination, so to speak. Reason can't operate without imaginative stuff, meaningful stuff, supplied to it for it to reason about. If you take imagination away, reason is just left there, floating in mid-air, so to speak, spinning its wheels, unable to get any traction on any meaningful material. Reason can't work without imagination. Take reason away, and imagination stays where it is, so to speak. Imagination doesn't rest upon reason, but is perfectly able to go on producing its meaningful findings without relating them to rational investigation. If you take reason away, imagination remains where it was, but it is now, as it were, released from having to report its findings to any higher court. It's now simply laid back imagination, unrelated to rational supervision. And in Lewis's terminology, this sort of imagination is what he calls the imaginary. Whereas this kind of imagination is the imaginative. Imaginary, imaginative. The merely imaginary is the sort of miasma of meaningful images which flood through our minds at night in our dreams, they're meaningful, but they're not necessarily true or false. We're not really bothered in our dream life to establish whether they're true or false. We're swayed, aren't we, in our dream life this way and that by all sorts of potent images, but we're not really concerned with whether they're true or false, not usually. I mean, sometimes you might wake up thinking, oh, I learnt something true in my dream last night, but not usually. Now, it should be obvious how, working with these definitions, Lewis views science as necessarily and foundationally imaginative. Because science works with meaningful things that it then reasons about. Perfectly simple. And one of Lewis's sources for this idea of imagination as the sine qua non of knowledge, true knowledge, was his close friend Owen Barfield. And if you've got that handout in front of you, look at the second quotation on the sheet, which comes from Barfield's book Poetic Diction, a very important book which influenced both Lewis and Tolkien considerably. Science deals with the world which it perceives, but seeking more and more to penetrate the veil of naive perception, progresses only towards the goal of nothing, because it still does not accept in practice, whatever it may admit theoretically, that the mind first creates what it perceives as objects, including the instruments which science uses for that very penetration. It insists on dealing with data, but there shall no data be given, save the bare percept. The rest is imagination. Only by imagination, therefore, can the world be known. And what is needed is not only that larger and larger telescopes should be constructed, but that the human mind should become increasingly aware of its own creative activity. Barfield goes on to argue in his book that Newton, for example, with his term gravity, which originally meant weight, and Kepler, with his term focus, which originally meant hearth, these scientists were developing meaning, not simply discovering fact. And these linguistic terms were as much part of their instruments as the material instruments themselves, because they were concepts applied to percepts in new ways, which were judged to be illuminating, but which were functions of the imagination. I don't know why I'm pointing at my brain. Where is the imagination located? They were functions of the imagination rather than objective tools. So for Barfield, scientific and religious knowledge are indistinguishable in kind. The scientific method doesn't give us a new way of knowing, only a new way of testing, and a new set of terms to bother about testing. The next issue to investigate is what are the things that science characteristically finds meaningful? And to help us in this part of our investigation, let us turn to another of Lewis's essays, this one called The Language of Religion, which opens with him listing 3 different sentences as follows. This is the next quotation on your sheet. 1. It was very cold. 2. There were 13 degrees of frost. 3. Bitter chill it was. The owl, for all his feathers, was a cold. The hare limped trembling through the frozen grass, and silent was the flock in woolly folds, numb were the beadsman's fingers. Lewis describes the first sentence as ordinary language, the second as scientific language, and the third as poetic language. It's a quotation from John Keats's The Eve of St. Agnes. Scientific and poetic language are 2 different artificial perfections of ordinary language. By artificial, Lewis simply means that scientific and poetic language both depend on certain skills. The skills of, in the scientific case, inventing, using and reading a thermometer to tell us that there are 13 degrees of frost. And in the case of poetic language, the skills of meter, rhyme, alliteration, assonance, allusion, connotation, and all the other things that Keats is deploying in those sentences. Lewis notes that ordinary language can advance a little towards either of the other two, so that you could pass by degrees to scientific if you chose, or to poetic if you chose. Advancing towards the scientific, you could substitute freezing hard for very cold. Or you could say freezing harder than last night. By such tweaks and modulations, you could turn your ordinary language closer and closer towards scientific. Alternatively, you could say it was bitterly cold. And then you'd be getting nearer to poetic language. In fact, you would have anticipated one of Keats's own terms. Having made these general observations about different kinds of language, Lewis then proceeds to draw the following conclusions. He says this: the superiority of the scientific description clearly consists in giving for the coldness of the night a precise quantitative estimate which can be tested by an instrument. The test ends all disputes. If the statement survives the test, then various inferences can be drawn from it with certainty. For example, various effects on vegetable and animal life can be predicted. It is therefore of use in what Francis Bacon called operation. We can take action on it. On the other hand, it does not of itself give us any information about the quality of a cold night. It doesn't tell us what we shall be feeling if we go out of doors. If, having lived all our lives in the tropics, we didn't know what a hard frost was like, the thermometer reading would not of itself inform us. Ordinary language would do that better. Your ears will ache. You'll lose the feeling in your fingers. You'll feel as if your ears are coming off. Turning to poetic language, Lewis says that its superiority to ordinary language is a much more troublesome affair. He says that he feels fairly sure what this example of poetic language doesn't consist in. It doesn't consist either in discharging or arousing mere emotion. It may do one of these things, or both, but he doesn't think that that is its distinguishing feature. He says, I don't think our bit of Keats differs from the ordinary "it was very cold" primarily or solely by getting off Keats's chest mere dislike of cold nights, nor by arousing mere dislike in me. There is, no doubt, some mere getting off the chest in the exclamation "ah" and the catachresis "bitter," but personally I don't feel the emotion to be either Keats's or mine. It is for me the imagined people in the story who are saying "ah" and "bitter," not with the result of making me share their discomfort, but of making me imagine how very cold it was. And the rest is all taken up with pictures of what might have been observed on such a night. The invitation is not to my emotions, but to my senses. Keats seems to me to be simply conveying the quality of a cold night. He is, in fact, giving me all that concrete, qualitative information which the scientific statement leaves out. But then, of course, he is not verifiable, nor precise, nor of much use for operation. Now, that reference to the qualitative nature of the information provided by poetic language implies the kind of things that science finds meaningful. Science finds not qualitative but quantitative things meaningful. Things that are quantifiable, measurable, instrumentalizable, useful in operation. And it's for this reason that scientific statements are so verifiable or falsifiable. They are, as Lewis puts it, far more easily cached than statements made either in ordinary language or poetic language. You can test them. But the poet might, of course, reply that it is always easier to cash a cheque for 30 shillings than one for £1,000. That the scientific statements are cheques in one sense for very small amounts, giving us, he says, out of the teeming complexity of every concrete reality, only the common measurable features. Now, the smallness of scientific statements is often obscured by their successfulness. Scientific statements succeed in defining and predicting certain pockets of the natural world, if they are true scientific statements. They provide us with definitions and predictions which can be put to use in curing smallpox, or building the internal combustion engine, devising the microchip. The magnificence of such scientific achievements is so huge that it can, if we're not careful, mislead us into thinking that they have said a great deal, when actually they've said relatively little, but said it very well. A true scientific statement has to be relatively small, because it's only relatively small things that can be said with sufficient univocality to be empirically verifiable or falsifiable. You might think it preposterous to describe the mapping of the human genome as a small statement. But genetics is only one department of biology, and biology is only one department of science, and science is only one department of human knowledge. Seen in the context of all that could possibly be said about a human being, socially, psychologically, spiritually, economically, historically, geographically, emotionally, dermatologically, cephalogically, any genetic statement, however marvelously correct, is still a minuscule fraction of the total. When you start trying to make larger statements, you move into the language of the humanities, and then into the arts, and then into religion. Religious statements, by saying things which attempt to explain life in the round, to give totalizing explanations, use language which is very hard to quantify, to measure, to test. But that's because they're trying to say a very great deal. They're trying to find the unity, the oneness, the heart of all reality. Here, the stake is not a mere 30 shillings, but every penny you have, your life and your soul. I'm now about two-thirds of the way through my talk. Let's summarize what we have seen so far. We've seen from Letters to Malcolm that for Lewis, science is a subset of that set which is the religious life in all its fullness. We've seen from Blusballs and Flallenspheres that science is fundamentally imaginative. And we've seen from the language of religion that science makes statements that are small but tremendously useful. Now, in the last part of my talk, I want to focus in on one particular scientific statement or scientific development that Lewis paid particular attention to. The biggest book that Lewis ever wrote was this: English Literature in the 16th Century, excluding drama. Very snappy title, I think you will agree. It was part of this multi-volume series of books called The Oxford History of English Literature, with different authors tackling different centuries. And Lewis referred to it as the Oh Hell volume. It's a 700-page discussion of pretty much everything written in English except drama during those 100 years. So this is where we come to Lewis's interactions with science as a literary and intellectual historian. Well, I needn't remind you how in the middle of the 16th century Nicholas Copernicus revolutionized astronomy with his theory of the heliocentric cosmos. His epoch-making work on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, published in 1546, has been described as the biggest shift that there's ever been in the history of human thought, because Copernicus, in a sense, relocated Earth. Until Copernicus, everyone pretty much thought that Earth was the centre. After Copernicus, we realised that the sun was at the centre and we are at the edge. We go round the sun does not go round us. Single-handedly, Copernicus moved us from the middle of things to the periphery. And of course, his theory was proved later to be correct by Kepler and Galileo when the telescope was invented early in the 17th century. Lewis was interested in the imaginative effects of the Copernican revolution. As a literary critic and literary historian, he wanted to see how the new heliocentric cosmos affected the sort of literature that people would write. As it happened, so he argues, the new Copernican cosmos didn't immediately seep into the public consciousness in the 16th century. Shakespeare, who died in the second decade of the 17th century, wrote all his plays almost exclusively from the presupposition of the Ptolemaic cosmology. It takes a while for scientific discoveries to trickle down. However, in due course, the Copernican revolution did indeed trickle down to affect writers and, through them, the general populace. Copernicus would eventually become a kind of totem, a hurrah word for writers who wished to caricature the Middle Ages as a bad period from which humanity did well to escape. And Lewis satirises that sort of lazy journalistic thinking in his inaugural lecture when he became professor of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge. He invited his readers, his audience, to reread the first chapter of a book called Early Tudor Poetry by a chap called Burden. And in that book, J.M. Burden writes, and about that book, Lewis says, it is still in many ways a useful book, but it is now difficult to read it without a smile. We begin with 29 pages of unrelieved gloom about grossness, superstition, and cruelty to children. And on the 29th page comes the sentence, "The first rift in this darkness is the Copernican doctrine." As if a new hypothesis in astronomy would naturally make a man stop hitting his daughter about the head. That's one effect that the Copernican revolution had. It allowed lazy writers to start hitting the Middle Ages over the head. But obviously it's not a very important effect, and Lewis includes it simply to amuse his audience at the start of his lecture. The more serious effects of the Copernican revolution on human imagination relate to what Lewis calls the mythology that follows in the wake of science. That's a phrase from his Out of the Silent Planet novel. The cosmology that a given generation accepts has, sooner or later, immense consequences for its thoughts and emotions. And in every generation there is this mythology that follows in the wake of science. A mythology that feeds into our understanding of ourselves and the way we imaginatively interpret the world and our place in it. Quote 4 on your handout. Garrett Green says this: "From Galileo and Newton to Einstein and Stephen Hawking, the reigning scientific models of the cosmos have provided the larger culture with powerful analogies and metaphors that shape its epistemology, its poetry, its politics, and, its religion. Many of the leading postmodernist ideas borrow much of their imagery and not a little of their social prestige from scientific notions of relativity, uncertainty, and incommensurability." Lewis was particularly alive to the cultural consequences of scientific paradigm shifts because of his intimate scholarly acquaintance with the Copernican revolution. His volume on the 16th century begins with a 14-page treatment of the new astronomy, which was brought in by Copernicus and later verified by Kepler and Galileo. And Lewis concludes that what proved important about the new astronomy was not the mere alteration in our map of space, but the methodological revolution which verified it. He says this is quote 5 on your sheet from the O'Hell volume. By reducing nature to her mathematical elements, the new cosmos, the new astronomy, substituted a mechanical for a genial or animistic conception of the universe. The world was emptied, first of her indwelling spirits, then of her occult sympathies and antipathies, finally of her colours, smells and tastes. Kepler, at the beginning of his career, explained the motion of the planets by their anima motrices, their motive spirits. Before he died, he explained it mechanically. A mechanical paradigm, Lewis argues, has now become very much the operative paradigm. And the older view of nature as teeming with humours, with influences, and the four elements disposed in particular realms or homes, that older view was overthrown. Hence the title of Lewis's last book, The Discarded Image. That old image of the cosmos was discarded. But these developments weren't necessary or totally logical consequences of Copernicus's theory. They were the collateral effects. They were the unscientific or non-scientific consequences caused by his scientific advance. And similar non-scientific or unscientific effects follow every major scientific paradigm shift, as Lewis points out in a pair of lectures he gave to an audience of scientists at the Zoological Laboratory in Cambridge in 1956. For instance, he's talking about the Newtonian revolution with respect to gravity. He points out that medieval people never talked of gravitation. Their way of describing it is to say that every natural object has a native or proper place and is always trying or desiring to get there. When unimpeded, flame moves upwards and solid bodies move downwards because they want to go, you may call it, home. This wasn't animism, Lewis says. They didn't really think that all matter was sentient. They will distinguish, he says, animate and inanimate as clearly as we do. We'll say that stones, for example, have only being, vegetables, being and life, animals, being, life and sense, man, being, life, sense and reason. So they make all the distinctions that we do. The truth is that the language of inanimate bodies seeking home used in the Middle Ages was the same kind of language that the modern person uses when speaking about the laws of nature. Lewis says this in those lectures. This is quote 6 on your sheet. When a modern says that the stone fell in obedience to the law of gravitation, he doesn't really think there is literally a law or literal obedience, that the stone on being released whips out a little book of statutes, finds the chapter and paragraph relevant to its predicament, and decides it had better be a law-abiding stone and come quiet. Nor did the medieval man believe that the stone really felt homesick, or felt at all. Both ways of putting it are analogical. Neither speaker would usually know any way of expressing the facts except by an analogy. But of course it makes a great difference to the tone of your mind which analogy you adopt, whether you fill your universe with phantom police courts and traffic regulations, or with phantom longings and endeavours. So following the scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th centuries, the machine, the laws of nature, It was Francis Bacon, Lewis says, who first started to talk of laws of nature by analogy with jurisprudence. The machine, the laws, these were terms that began to affect the attitudes people had to the world. They began to make people suppose that things were regular, impersonal, essentially lifeless. And this tendency was soon reinforced by another new term that arrived in the wake of the Copernican revolution, namely space. Space, in this sense, was first coined probably not by a scientist, but, as Lewis points out in the discarded image, by the poet John Milton, sometime in the 17th century. Space may produce new worlds, we read in Paradise Lost, Book 1, line 650. Space may produce new worlds. You won't find space used in that sense before the 17th century. And the fact that it was a poet, not a scientist, who coined this new sense of the word emphasizes Lewis's point about the effects of science often being unscientific or non-scientific. New scientific thinking feeds out into the wider culture and is taken up and put to all sorts of uses with all sorts of implications which have nothing or little to do with whether the earth goes round the sun or not. But to think of the firmament above our heads as space rather than as the heavens, as was commonly the term used before Copernicus, is to introduce a whole new quality of emptiness or hollowness into the universe. Earth, Lewis says, is now adrift in a void, rather than the focus of a network of planetary relationships. Look up into the night sky these days, Lewis suggests in the discarded image, and you will find, if you're a typically modern person with a typically modern imagination, that it's the formlessness and the vacuity that strike you. The sense of a black and trackless waste will have replaced the sense of a vast lighted concavity filled with purposes and homes and desires and signifiers. There's that very interesting exchange, isn't there, in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, when Eustace, I think it is, says to a star, he's met this star character, and he says to this star, in our world a star is just a huge ball of flaming gas. And the star replies to him and says, well, even in your world, my son, that's not necessarily what a star is, but only what it is made of. Motion, mechanism, mensuration, the terms that science tends to employ when looking at the universe are not the only terms that we may use. And what I think Lewis is suggesting in these passages is that we simply need to be careful about the knock-on effects of scientific language and scientific paradigms, and to ask whether all the apparent implications of a new term need be embraced. As a literary critic, a literary historian, a philologist and a man of letters generally, Lewis had a great concern to purify the dialect of the tribe, to quote T.S. Eliot's phrase. You only need to read his fascinating book, Studies in Words, to see how minutely Lewis inspected every ramification and connotation of certain words as they changed their meanings over time. And many contributors to science and religion debates, I think, would probably benefit from reading his chapters in that book, Studies in Words, the chapters on nature, world, life. For there can be diseases in language, Lewis argues, and there can certainly be fashions, and we need to be on our watch against these if we're to think clearly and to speak wisely. To quote again Owen Barfield, Lewis's lifelong friend, Barfield once said that of all devices for dragooning the human spirit, the least clumsy is to procure its abortion in the womb of language. Just destroy a word and then you won't allow people to think that word anymore. And although scientists, of course, can't be held responsible for every use or indeed misuse that their characteristic metaphors are put to, scientists themselves may begin to put too much weight on particular paradigms, particular metaphors, mistaking their linguistic symbols for the things symbolized. This is a subject that Lewis touches upon in his epilogue to the discarded image, a fascinatingly provocative chapter which we could really have spent the whole lecture on. But let me finish by quoting the final 2 paragraphs of that epilogue, and by then showing its relevance to Lewis's perspective on Christianity. So this is the final quote on your sheet. I hope no one will think that I'm recommending a return to the medieval model. I'm only suggesting considerations that may induce us to regard all models of the cosmos in the right way, respecting each and idolizing none. We are all very properly familiar with the idea that in every age the human mind is deeply influenced by the accepted model of the universe. But there is a two-way traffic. The model is also influenced by the prevailing temper of mind. We must recognize that what has been called a taste in universes is not only pardonable but inevitable. We can no longer dismiss the change of models as a simple progress from error to truth. No model is a catalogue of ultimate phenomena. No model is a catalogue of ultimate realities, and none is a mere fantasy. Each is a serious attempt to get in all the phenomena known at a given period, and each succeeds in getting in a great many. But also, no less surely, each reflects the prevalent psychology of an age, almost as much as it reflects the state of that age's knowledge. Hardly any battery of new facts could have persuaded an ancient Greek that the universe had an attribute so repugnant to him as infinity. Hardly any such battery could persuade a modern that it is hierarchical. It is not impossible that our own model will die a violent death, ruthlessly smashed by an unprovoked assault of new facts, unprovoked as the nova of 1572, which showed the translunary realm to be mutable. But I think it is more likely to change when and because far-reaching changes in the mental temper of our descendants demand that it should. The new model will not be set up without evidence, but the evidence will turn up when the inner need for it becomes sufficiently great. It will be true evidence. But nature gives most of her evidence in answer to the questions we ask her. Here, as in the courts, the character of the evidence depends on the shape of the examination, and a good cross-examiner can do wonders. He will not indeed elicit falsehoods from an honest witness, but in relation to the total truth in the witness's mind, the structure of the examination is like a stencil. It determines how much of that total truth will appear and what pattern it will suggest. So Lewis is urging scientists, I think, to hold their metaphors and their overall paradigms with a due provisionality, reminding them that an image of the cosmos, no less actually than an image of the divine, can become a graven image, an idol. Religion and science both need a degree of humility and oughtn't to suppose that they can fully capture reality in their own terminology. In Lewis's Christian view, an image of God, even a scriptural image of God, such as shepherd, king, judge, bridegroom, no such image can in itself contain the entirety of that which it refers to. It, he says, is only a symbol, like the reality in some respects, but unlike it in others, and therefore needs correction from the different symbols. To that extent, religious language is the same as an image of the cosmos, scientific language. The Einsteinian view of the cosmos hasn't completely supplanted the Newtonian model, and nor did the Newtonian model improve upon the Ptolemaic model in absolutely every respect. At any rate, Lewis suggests, as we've seen, that the Newtonian model with its metaphors of laws and physical bodies obeying rules is a good deal more anthropomorphic than the pre-Copernican model with its characteristic metaphors of kindly inclining, seeking home. Cosmologies, no less than theologies, are human constructs, linguistic constructs, and both must therefore be approached with a certain tentativeness. Lewis wrote, "My idea of God is not a divine idea." But Lewis could also write, and from much the same perspective, "No model of the universe is a catalogue of ultimate realities." Insofar as an image of God becomes a divine image, then it becomes demonic, he says, and the true God in mercy shatters it. He is the great iconoclast. Likewise, with respect to cosmologies, it is not impossible that our own Einsteinian model will die a violent death, ruthlessly smashed by an unprovoked assault of new facts. Therefore, let us continually bear in mind those considerations that may induce us to regard all models in the right way, respecting each and idolizing none. For mere words cannot fully contain the divine word, nor even the things that the divine word has made. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Our respondent to this afternoon's lecture is Stephanie Gehring. Stephanie is a native of Germany and occasionally of Portland, Oregon. She completed her undergraduate studies at St. Olaf's College, holds an MFA in poetry from Cornell, has completed a master's in theological studies at Duke University, where she focused on beauty in the thought of Simone Weil and Augustine, and her doctoral studies continue that line of inquiry, looking at the connection between beauty and ethics in the work of Simone Weil. She recently published a review of a film on Weil that appeared in Books and Culture, and she has also been very influenced by the work of Jeremy Begbie, who also happens to be Michael Ward's doctoral advisor.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here and to be getting to think about this really thought-provoking lecture and these ideas with all of you. There are three moments in the essay that struck me especially, and the first is the description of the relationship between imagination and reason. And I've heard a lot of descriptions of that are much more antagonistic, and so I really enjoyed Lewis's understanding where they're friends. And I like the idea that they're both dependent on each other and also in some sense separate but working together. So imagination can function in a sense without reason, but it can't arbitrate its own meanings, and then reason can arbitrate the meanings of imagination, but it can't actually function on its own because it has nothing to reason about. And the second point that caught me was the idea of scientific, ordinary, and poetic language and the ways that they're different. And I was struck by, first of all, just that idea that we're beginning with ordinary language and then scientific and poetic language are both trying to do, in a sense, more work than ordinary language does, but in different directions, that science is narrowing down and being precise and verifiable, and poetic language is writing very large checks that are harder to cash. And it seems a little bit, in talking about it that way, and in talking then about religious language as being somewhat in the direction of poetry, as though religious language is sort of going farther and writing even bigger and even more difficult to cash checks. And I thought that the other parts of C.S. Lewis's thought that you point out counterbalance that well, that science is a subset of religion, and that scientific knowledge is also part of religious knowledge. And it reminds me of my housemate when I was living in Ithaca, who was a plant pathologist and had a garden. And I remember being struck by how much there is to know in planting a garden, and how sort of mind-bogglingly long it would take me just to write down all of the things that she's doing without even articulating them, knowing when it's likely to be warm enough that the basil's not going to freeze overnight if she plants it, and that this particular kind of blight on her tomatoes might be caused by the black walnut that's growing next to the garden patch. And that there's something like that in the relation between religion and science, or religious and scientific knowledge, that there's more to Amara's planting a garden than just that there are too many facts to write down in what she's thinking about. There's also a qualitative element, but there are also just too many facts to write down that she knows in this way that is, she knows it better than a book knows it. And the last point that I thought about a lot was the mythology that follows in the wake of science, and the kind of metaphors that science pulls after it. And Matt and Laura Tiscareno pointed out to me that Michael Pollan says something like this, actually relates to the second point and to this, about the ways that scientific descriptions of food have, in a sense, seemed like they increase our knowledge of what food is by saying, well, it has this many calories and this much of all these different nutrients. But in a way, they've actually narrowed what we know about food and how we understand what it means to be nourished. And I like also C.S. Lewis's historical overview of the different ways that metaphors have functioned in the past, and the kind of non-condescension of that science has progressed vastly, and there are real measurable advances that weren't there 100 or 1,000 years ago. And yet the way that science affects language has not really changed that much. So the mechanism, the metaphor of going home if a stone is falling, and the mechanism of the metaphor of falling because it's obeying a law, the metaphors are working the same way, even though they're parts of different scientific paradigms. And that reminded me of a conversation I had in a philosophy class last semester, where the professor was talking about what would happen if you took Aristotle as a scientist and put him in a room with a bunch of scientists today, that he would just be probably completely lost. But that if you took Plato or Aristotle or Socrates and put them in a room with a whole bunch of contemporary philosophers, that would not happen in the same way, because there's a kind of progress that isn't possible and hasn't happened in philosophy in the way that it has in science. And it also reminded me of a conversation I had when I was still at Cornell in a fiction writing class with Stephanie Vaughn about conventions. And we were talking in this case about cinema and theater, and about the ways that if one is accustomed to seeing film rather than to seeing drama on a stage, then a human eye being 15 feet long doesn't feel strange and doesn't feel unrealistic. But actual human beings on a stage dressed in costumes feel somehow odd, and we have to get over them in order to find our way into the story, because the conventions that we're used to become invisible to us. And so one question that I have for you about C.S. Lewis's thought, and about yours also, is how we might go about making the conventions of scientific metaphor and of scientific mythology more apparent to ourselves, and as Owen Barfield said, of paying more attention to the process of our own creative language in knowing history seems like a part of the answer to that. But I'd be curious to hear more.
Michael has asked if he has an opportunity to respond to our responder, and my answer was no. I would like to engage the audience promptly, but Stephanie did me the favor of asking you a question.
I misunderstood you, Carl. Sorry.
So if you would like to.
The question was how scientists might become more, or people in general might become more aware of the invisible assumptions of metaphorical usage. Is that what your question was?
Or how do we make good choices about how we let those metaphors shape how we know and how we approach the universe?
Well, I think probably Lewis's answer. I myself don't really have an answer. I'm not a philosopher of the history of science myself. I think Lewis's answer would be simply to be continually aware of the history of science, and to remember that there have been other paradigms than the one we now sit within, and to recall the labour and the crises which attend the installation of a new paradigm. Just about the time Lewis died, actually, that very influential book came out on the structure of scientific revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. And Kuhn's thought echoes and reflects very much, I think, Lewis's attitude to the subject, that science proceeds sometimes by accumulation of data and sometimes by revolution. And the revolutionary installation of a new paradigm is always attended by great trouble and strife. But if we recall how our current paradigm was arrived at through trouble and strife, it may help us to recall that it's not the be-all and end-all, and it may itself undergo an unprovoked assault of new facts as science progresses to the next stage of its knowledge. So I think that's as much of his answer as I have been able to detect, just an awareness of the history of science and not just its current functionality.
Good. Questions from the audience? For either or both speaker.
Yeah, thanks so much for the talk. Great. Would Lewis have admitted the current model, the idea of the universe, in science, in psychology, having influenced him?
Oh yes, not least.
Does he interact that way?
Yeah, I mean, even if you are trying to reject something or answer it, not that Lewis was wanting to reject the Einsteinian model of the cosmos or anything like that, but even to answer something is to be influenced by it, he says somewhere. So, of course he was influenced by it. Perhaps a better example would be Freudian psychoanalysis. I mean, he was rather questioning of that. And so, insofar as he was trying to defeat it or revise it, he was being influenced by it. Yeah. Am I answering your question? What's sort of lying behind your question? Is that?
Yeah, just the way the talk goes, there could be some takeaway that Lewis sort of saw himself as exempt and able to give an unbiased view
Yeah.
in philosophy.
Yeah.
I just wonder if he sort of admitted with that weakness of his own, or being
Well, of course, yes.
sort of trapped by bias.
Yeah.
His science
Well,
and
exactly. Every human being is a human being, and no one has the divine supervision. But I think this is where he would come back to the importance of history, and indeed he says that history is really freeing and liberating because it reminds us that the people in the past have adopted different views. I mean, and he says there's no magic about the past. We can't assume that the people in the past, because they had a different view, had the right view. They were just as prone to make mistakes as we are, but not probably the same mistakes. So that's, I think, one of his reasons for reading history. for reminding ourselves of previous paradigms, even if they look totally stupid to us. Just the fact that we can hopefully, through a process of imaginative empathy, historical empathy, situate our minds within that paradigm is itself enlarging and freeing to a certain extent. So I think he would probably criticize people who lock themselves into only the current paradigm. He's not completely free by virtue of knowing about previous paradigms, but he's more free. And he's wanting other people to have a similar level of freedom. There was Sam up there.
I was wondering if Lewis had anything to say about social sciences when he studied, wrote extensively about Freud, so I guess that answers my question. That it seems that the physical examples you gave are somehow different from the social science model, because the social scientific theories have something directly to say about our philosophy and about our the metaphors of physical theory don't. So I was just wondering what you have to say about that.
Yes, he was much more chary of social sciences than of the hard sciences. I think he was quite suspicious, really, of the value of things like sociology. Because I suspect he thought that it was a kind of category mistake to try to treat human beings as if they were objects. Whereas, of course, the thing under inspection is also the thing which is doing the inspecting. We are human beings, studying human beings. And so we can't just assume that they are different from us or other than us. No, I don't know how much he knew about sociology, perhaps not as much as he should have done. And it may be that sociology has a way of getting around that problem, or a way of recognizing its intrinsic sort of self-reflectiveness. I don't know. But he was quite troubled by some developments, I think, in social sciences. He writes about this a little bit in That Hideous Strength, for instance. Mark Studdock, the male protagonist of that book, is a sociologist. Lewis has some very scathing things to say about him in that story. Well, I think that the polarization which you're mentioning, I think might be less severe in Europe than it is in America, and B, was a good deal less severe even in Europe in Lewis's day than it is now. So I don't think he has that much to say on the subject, to be honest. But yeah.
So I guess what I'm interested in is, you clearly think that this is, and I do too, a very valuable thing for us to be considering. And so I'm
Yes.
just asking you what you think.
Right.
Drawing on this, that maybe we can take away even a little bit more specifically into the.
Yeah. Well, I think one very valuable thing, I think, is simply the recognition of the metaphoricalness of language. Indeed, that's one of the main thrusts of that essay, Bluspel's and Flallan's spheres, that as soon as we get beyond sense impressions, pointing at this table or that carpet, as soon as we start talking about states of minds and relationships and things like that, our language becomes incurably metaphorical, and we apprehend none of these things except through metaphor. And Lewis goes on and says that how does he put it? It's a rather complicated sentence, but he's basically saying that someone who assumes that all their language is literal he was probably speaking without much sense. So I think, that's one of the reasons for Lewis's hostility to fundamentalism in religion, and a fundamentalist way of reading Scripture. Lewis thought was obviously wrong, because Scripture is filled with metaphors, and actually even fundamentalists understand certain metaphors. But Lewis thinks they don't go far enough in understanding the metaphoricalness of Scripture. So I think that will be one major value to his thought on this subject that we can take into our own debates, our own controversies. Remember the metaphoricalness of our language. And another thing is Lewis's recognition as a Christian that God is the Father of lights. He's very fond of that verse from James's epistle. God is the Father of lights, all lights. Scientific lights, no less than religious lights, no less than literary lights, come from God. All truth is God's truth. And so we shouldn't, if we are Christians, we shouldn't be alarmed by certain fields of thought which are saying certain things. We just need to respect that paradigm operative in that field of study and rejoice in any truth that it reveals. Thank you.
Yes.
I hope this isn't too much recapitulation of the questions just asked, or the question that precedes that question. I hope it's an elaboration. Let's see. One of the things that emerges very clearly from it during your discourse and during your wonderful response is that the juxtaposition of two metaphorical systems, which seem at first to announce their distinction, reveals at last their failure to distinguish themselves one from another. And by that I mean this: as both speakers have pointed out, both metaphorical systems implicitly reproduce precisely a subject within the object of at first nominally religious and subsequently nominally scientific investigation or interpretation. That is to say, the falling stone acts either out of love or fear, we might say, out of either a punctilious concern with coming quietly, or out of a species of nostalgia. And what we don't have in the contradistinction which putatively lies athwart this epic-making shift is any real intellectual, and in a way even any imaginative work done to suddenly divest the object world of its indwelling spirit. In short, the advent of the astronomical innovations or new ways of looking at things cannot do, or at least in these instances has not done, any actual work to affect the disenchantment of the world, the evaporation of the world into an object status, free of any indwelling spirit. Something else, at least collateral, must have occurred for other, possibly, as many of the metaphors here indicate, violent reasons. I'm sorry about the long-windedness of that, which doesn't seem at first to be a question, but of course, which contains the implicit question, what would that be in your view, or Lewis's? And I'm going to cheat and run really quick to this other thing too, the business of the social sciences, because of the interesting character of the response to that, which includes the crucial element of self-reference and the paradoxes and opportunities that attend it. To some degree, it seems contemporary scientific models like the Einsteinian and like quantum mechanics, importantly developed by Schrödinger, resituate the subject at the center of the cosmos by making the point of view crucially determinative of the data and our interpretation. That's what Einstein does. He imagines what would happen if he were a photon going that fast. How would the world look to him? And that was what Schrödinger points out with his famous cat paradox. It is not the interference of the propagating wave with any macroscopic system that produces its collapse. It's somebody looking at it, getting a signal to wind it up. Any hope? So, first, why did it happen? And two, any hope in these new developments that first seem hostile to God, but maybe implicitly somewhat
Maybe implicitly
somewhat friendly. That's to say the last thing. The reason, modern physics.
Right. Golly, that is... Why did it happen? Golly, I don't know. I mean, 100 reasons, 1,000 reasons.
I think you did a good job pointing out it's not rational. We think it is, and it's not. It's something else happening, but it's not.
Yes, yeah. I mean, your question is very thought-provoking indeed. I, apart from saying 1,000 reasons for why it happened, there's not much point in my trying to get any more focused than that. To be honest, but I'd be more interested in focusing on your second question about. What was your second question again?
It seems that it's possible that a qualified reintroduction of the subject.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Well, exactly. How can we know anything except by knowing something? It is always we who know. We can't jump off our own shadow. So everything must be filtered through this prism of our mind, of our spirit. For Lewis, the best way to escape that limiting self-referentiality is again through knowledge of other points of view, which you get through history and through reading. I mean, that's the very interesting conclusion to his book, An Experiment in Criticism, where he says that we read novels because it enlarges our being. We can now see what the world looks like to other minds, other than our own, even imagined minds. We can begin to imagine what the world might look like to a dog, for instance, or even to entities which have never existed at all, which are entirely fictitious. We are never more ourselves than when we escape ourselves, he says. We are never more ourselves than when we do this. Here, as in love, in moral action, we exceed ourselves and are never more ourselves than when we do. It's a very powerful conclusion to that book. But it puts me in mind also of the second book in his Ransom trilogy, Perelandra, where he imagines planetary spirits, angels, Eldila as he calls them, the Ousiarch, the prevailing spirit of Mars and Venus, manifest themselves to Ransom at the end of that book. And they show themselves to him in two different forms. First of all, as some sort of cloud and billowing, jagged lightning, which he can't accept. And then they take another attempt, and he sees cogs and wheels moving with a sort of sickening slowness. And he says, that's no good either. And they make a third attempt to present themselves to him. And this time he can take it. And then he says to them, do I see you as you really are? And they reply, interestingly, only God sees anything as it really is. Or only Meleldil, the name of God in that book. Only God sees anything as it really is. We only see an appearance of reality, not reality itself, which theologically would tie in with the idea that we never know God in his essence. We know God in his energies. But that is, a lot better than nothing.
And I'd also say that quantum physics and Schrödinger are not just saying that all knowledge the knowledge is not in the object, it's in the subject. They're saying that whole distinction was not quite tenable to begin with, that our claiming we were separate as knowers was not tenable. And then back also to your question and to the question about sociology a little bit. I think that in order for conversation to be really possible, there has to be a kind of respect that's on both sides. And it has to be both faith that is saying all truth is God's truth, and I'm not going to be suspicious and angry. But if there's going to be real conversation, then scientists also have to not do things like what Richard Dawkins did when he came to Duke and said, well, the Divinity School has no place here. This is an institution of higher learning.
I have a question that I want to address to you, Stephanie. Michael apologized at the beginning of his talk for implying that science and religion were somehow discontinuous ways of knowing. But to take his first couplet in the title, Reason and Imagination. You're a poet. Poetry, I think it's fair to say, is not highly valued in our culture. Is that fair to say?
I think so.
And part of that, I think, has to do with its association with the imagination as something that is somehow distinct from reason. Right? And science is a thing that takes us into the world, the stuff that's in front of us, empirical realities, things we can touch. And there's an impression among some that somehow poetry doesn't do that. Mm-hmm. Right? Poetry is other, it's interior. Right? Mm-hmm. Which is generally not actually the view of poets. I wonder if you could comment briefly on how you see the connection between reason and imagination from the perspective of a poet and ways in which poetry actually takes you into the same stuff of which science has as its object.
I think it's a lot like gardening, that there is all the stuff, and there are a lot of things that are worth saying about the stuff. It's worth saying that there were 13 degrees of frost, and it's also worth saying that it feels like your ears are going to come off, and it's also worth saying all of what Keats said and more, and they're not telling you the same thing. And I think one reason poetry is not valued is that there's a certain kind of understanding of science and of knowledge necessarily being empirical in a way that anyone who's alive really knows that it isn't, only they don't necessarily have the language for expressing that and taking it seriously, because the word got killed. But I think also that people who weren't friends with poetry have not had a good friend who was friends with poetry, and haven't had a sort of gardener to take them into the garden and say, this is how warm it needs to be for the basil, and this is how much water tomatoes need, and this is what the ground should feel like, and this is how high you put the dirt over the seed. And there's a kind of, and if that's true, I think, in the same way for science. If you are suspicious and afraid of science, it's because you have never had a good friend, in a way, who was a scientist, who could show you why to love this.
Yeah, can I chime in on that?
You may.
Yes, we haven't had a good friend in the poetry of the last 100 years. I think, that would be, one of Lewis's responses. That poetry, since the modernist revolution at the beginning of the 20th century, has become an inward-looking exercise, and poets are no longer looking out at their audience, trying to speak to the masses. They're speaking to an ever-decreasing coterie of specialists. And you need this hyper-technical language to understand some modern poetry. So it's not surprising it's losing its social value. So I think Lewis would say that that's partly the responsibility of poets, and it's something that he was trying to push back against very, very strongly. But on the other hand, I think it would be worth saying that Lewis's own definition of poetry is that the poet is the maker. That's what poetry fundamentally means, the maker of imaginative views. And of course we get plenty of poetry in films and novels. That is poetry of a kind. It's just what we tend to think of as poetry in the strict sense of verse, rhyming verse or not rhyming verse. That poetry has largely dried up. But poetry is still abounding in the rest of the culture, of course, because we are poetic beings. We have to have poetry or we die.
Two more questions in the back.
I actually have two questions. The first one is, in your first quote, you mentioned
which to me seems fairly natural. Kind of goes without saying, given that any scientist, any researcher, any scholar has to be a very, very imaginative person, because otherwise they've got nothing to reason about. I would expect a kind of more of a discussion of the contrast between reason and faith, because that's usually the discussion that you get in society, in the media, and so on. And so I was wondering what the reason for this departing from that usual kind of dichotomy and the reason versus imagination, why that was.
Right, thank you. On your first point, religion and irreligion and non-religion, well, for Lewis, the irreligious and the non-religious are not synonyms. A supposedly non-religious attitude would be an attitude which lives its life without reference to God, let us say. But that is impossible. That is not non-religious, that is irreligious, Lewis is saying, because God is part of our life whether we like it or not. That attitude of trying to live without reference to God is not non-religious, it's kind of blasphemy. So all your actions are religious, Lewis is saying. Are they good religious attitudes or bad religious attitudes? Are they in consort with reality or trying to react against it? That's what is the distinction between irreligious and non-religious. That's right. That's right, yeah. And then on your other point about reason and imagination versus reason and faith, well, I spoke about reason and imagination because Lewis writes about that more, I think, than this distinction between reason and faith. This is a very big topic to get into right at the end of a lecture. I think you can't talk about the distinction between reason and faith unless you have previously understood the role of imagination in reason. It's a prior matter to get clear in your head before you talk about this other distinction. The reason-faith distinction is a later distinction. And if our understanding of reason is a hyper enlightenment view of reason as a kind of strict and impersonal ratiocination, then we're going to see a much bigger gulf between reason and faith than we are if we accept that reason is necessarily imaginative. I think that's why it's important to get straight in our minds before we go on to that later distinction. The second distinction is less of a distinction if we have admitted the presence of imagination in all our knowing. So I think that's why it's worth addressing first. But good question, thank you.
Okay, and the final question right here.
In your last question you had, you talked about Lewis's comments towards regarding different scientific thought. I want to piggyback on that and translate that to his theological thought on what did Lewis think on different schools of theological thought and respecting those. Because me and my friend here had a conversation on if Lewis was an inclusivist. A lot of his writings don't really hit a lot of the hardcore doctrinal issues. So I just elaborate.
Yes, he was an inclusivist. I think his novel *The Last Battle* makes that fairly clear, as indeed does a brief passage in *Mere Christianity*. He wasn't a universalist. He didn't believe. He believed that it is possible to lose salvation or not to gain salvation. But he was an inclusivist. Yes. I'm not sure that I'm getting the larger part of your question.
Well, it's pretty much just I mean, the question is more towards his thought on different doctrines and how they relate to salvation. That would probably be the discussion.
Yeah.
But I mean, we were having this conversation before on the way here.
Right.
That'd be
Yes, yes, yes. Well, I think it's worth saying that Lewis was not very systematic in his doctrine. He wasn't doctrinaire in that sense. He held his theological doctrines quite loosely and indefinitely, if that's the right word. Because I think that he saw the risk of turning theology into a hard science, as it were. The whole point about, my idea of God is not a divine idea means that my own mental construction of what's going on in theology is not the principal thing. The principal thing is to meet God. And to find God, or to allow oneself to be found by God, irrespective of the name or the label or the system that you choose to lay over that encounter. In Surprised by Joy, his autobiography, he talks about this distinction between contemplating something from outside and enjoying it from within. And that was a huge breakthrough when he came across that distinction in his mid-20s. It was a huge breakthrough in his whole understanding of life and the universe and everything, that our knowledge of God is necessarily an enjoyment knowledge, a knowledge from within. We can't look at God like a specimen on a laboratory bench. That's not how we relate to God. We can't study God like a subject, like reading a railway timetable. We've got to get to know God in a personal manner. And there's interesting connections with some of the other questions that have been asked. Michael Polanyi's work on personal knowing has many affinities with Lewis in this respect. And Polanyi and Lewis almost certainly met in Oxford a few times. Polanyi addressed the Socratic Club in Oxford, which Lewis was the president of for many years. And I've often wondered whether Polanyi didn't perhaps begin to pick up some of these threads of ideas from Lewis's characteristic way of approaching these issues.
Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. One quick announcement before we conclude. We do have several copies of Dr. Ward's books, the big book, Planet Narnia, and the shorter treatment of the same topic, the Narnia Code, which are available for purchase and also available for him to sign. And finally, thank you very much to both of our speakers. Please join me.